Welcome back to another episode in our IB English B writing series. Today, we are focusing on one of the most powerful text types you may encounter in Paper 1, the speech. We will look at how to recognize when a speech is the most appropriate choice, how to plan around audience, context, and purpose, how to develop persuasive ideas, how to control register and tone, and importantly, how to use rhetorical techniques naturally without turning your response into a collection of devices. Throughout the lesson, we will refer to Old Major's speech from George Orwell's Animal Farm as a model. What matters here is not its political message, but the architecture of its persuasion. The speaker establishes a relationship with his listeners, builds credibility, identifies a problem, explains its cause, makes the issue personal, offers a vision of change, and finally calls the audience to act. That movement from understanding a problem to responding to it is exactly what a strong persuasive speech needs. But before you think about writing the speech itself, there is an earlier Paper 1 decision to make. Is a speech actually the most appropriate text type? In the exam, you are given a task followed by 3 possible text types. Your job is not simply to choose one that could work. You need to decide which option best matches the audience, the context, and the purpose. Imagine a task like this. Your school has noticed a significant increase in food waste during lunchtime. You have been invited to address students and encourage them to change their habits. In your text, explain the problem. Suggest practical ways students can reduce waste and persuade them to take responsibility. Your 3 options are speech, set of guidelines, or article. Which one is most appropriate? The speech is the strongest choice. Why? Because the task creates a clear speaking occasion. You are addressing students directly at a particular moment and trying to persuade them to change their behavior. A set of guidelines could communicate practical steps effectively, so it is a plausible alternative. But its natural focus would be instruction, what students should do, and how they should do it. An article could explain the problem and explore its consequences. However, it would not make full use of the immediate relationship between a speaker and a listening audience. Now, change the situation slightly. Your school wants students to know exactly what to do with leftover food, which bins to use, what can be composted, and where unopened food can be donated. Your 3 choices are speech, set of guidelines, or blog. This time, the set of guidelines is the strongest choice. Students need clear information they can scan, follow, and consult again later. The topic has barely changed, but the purpose has, and that changes the most appropriate text type. So, when deciding whether to choose a speech, do not focus simply on audience size. A speech might be delivered to 20 people in a classroom, or broadcast to millions. What matters is how the audience receives the message and what you are expected to achieve. A speech is especially appropriate when there is a speaker, a listening audience, a clear occasion, and an immediate communicative purpose. You may be addressing a school assembly, a community meeting, parents, counselors, delegates, or members of an organization. Because the text is intended to be heard, it should establish a relationship with the audience, sound natural when spoken, and guide listeners clearly from one idea to the next. This is why text type choice matters so much for Criterion C. The mark scheme considers whether the text type is appropriate, whether the register and tone suit the situation, and whether the conventions of that text type are recognizable throughout the response. In other words, one option may be the most appropriate, another may be possible but less natural, and a third may simply not fit the communication situation very well. Once you choose a speech, commit to it. Do not write an essay with "ladies and gentlemen" added at the beginning. Do not write an article and insert a few rhetorical questions. But write for listeners. At its core, a speech is written to be heard, not simply read. That affects sentence length, vocabulary, repetition, transitions, and paragraph development. Most importantly, it affects the relationship between speaker and audience. A useful model shows us how that relationship can develop. The speaker begins by establishing a connection with the listeners. He then creates credibility and defines the problem clearly. But he does not stop at saying that the situation is bad. He asks why it exists. That question matters. A persuasive argument needs more than a complaint. It needs reasoning. The speaker challenges the idea that the problem is natural or unavoidable, identifies a cause, and develops that explanation through examples. Then, the argument becomes personal. The wider issue is connected to the lives, work, families, and futures of individual listeners. Finally, analysis becomes action. The audience is given a shared identity, a possible future, and a reason to respond. That is rhetorical movement. A strong speech should change something between its first sentence and its last. Perhaps the audience understands an issue differently. Perhaps they feel greater urgency. Perhaps they reconsider an assumption, become more willing to support a proposal, or decide that action is necessary. Whatever your purpose is, the speech should move towards it, and that connects directly to Paper 1 assessment. Criterion A focuses on your command of language, vocabulary, grammatical range, and accuracy. At the highest level, the aim is not simply to use difficult language. Your vocabulary should be varied and nuanced, and more complex grammatical structures should be used selectively when they actually improve communication. So, complexity is useful only when it serves the message. Criterion B focuses on how effectively you fulfill the task. Your ideas need to be relevant, developed, and logically organized. Strong responses do not simply state opinions. They support them with examples, explanations, consequences, or other relevant details. Criterion C focuses on conceptual understanding. Does the text type fit the situation? Does the register suit the audience? Is the tone appropriate to the purpose? And does the response consistently sound like the text type you chose? These three criteria are closely connected. Direct address, for example, supports Criterion C because it helps make the response recognizably as speech. But it can also strengthen Criterion B because it keeps your message focused on the people you are trying to influence. Sentence variety contributes to Criterion A, but it can also make your argument more persuasive. So, instead of asking, "What technique can I use to get marks?" ask a more useful question. What language choice will help me communicate this idea to this audience? Before you begin writing, establish 4 things clearly: audience, context, purpose, and central message. Imagine another Paper 1 style task. Your local council is considering closing several public libraries because of financial pressure. You've been invited to speak at a public meeting attended by counselors, parents, teachers, and residents. You want to persuade the council to consider alternatives to complete closure. Your 3 options are speech, proposal, or leaflet. Here, the speech is the most appropriate choice. A proposal could present detailed recommendations, so it is certainly plausible. However, the task places you at a public meeting and asks you to influence people who are listening to you at that moment. A leaflet is weaker because the main purpose is not to distribute information that people can take away and consult later. Once you have chosen the speech, think carefully about your audience. Do not simply write, "My audience is people." Who are these people? Some are counselors with decision-making power. Others are parents, teachers, and residents who may influence that decision. Some may already support you. Others may believe that closing libraries is financially necessary. That immediately affects your tone. You need to sound confident, but not hostile, persuasive, but not childish, concerned, but not melodramatic. Then, think about context. Why are you speaking now? Because a decision is approaching. That creates urgency. Your speech should sound as though it belongs to this particular moment, not as though it was memorized in advance and could be copied into any task. Next, define your purpose precisely. To talk about libraries is not a useful purpose. To persuade the council to reject complete closure and consider alternative funding or restructuring gives the speech direction. Then, identify your central message. Perhaps your core idea is this: a public library is not simply a building containing books. It represents access to education, technology, opportunity, and community support. Now you have a thread that can run through the entire response. Once that is clear, plan the argument. And here is an important principle. Do not plan your speech by listing rhetorical devices. A weak plan might sound like this. Paragraph 1, rhetorical question. Paragraph 2, statistic. Paragraph 3, rule of 3. Paragraph 4, emotive language. That is not an argument. It is a checklist. Instead, plan stages of thought. Establish the situation. Define the problem. Explain why it matters. Develop 2 or 3 strong arguments. Acknowledge another perspective. Offer a realistic solution. Then build towards a final appeal. The ideas determine the structure. The techniques come later. When rhetorical devices work well, they feel natural because they are carrying the argument forward. A question directs attention. Repetition reinforces a central idea. Direct address makes the issue personal. The technique serves the thought, not the other way around. Now consider the opening. A weak speech often begins like this. Today I am going to talk about artificial intelligence. There is nothing grammatically wrong with the sentence. The problem is that it achieves very little. Another common opening is a dictionary definition. Unless the meaning of the term itself is central to your argument, you are probably spending valuable words explaining something the audience already understands. A strong opening should do several jobs quickly. It should acknowledge the audience, establish the occasion, introduce the issue, and point towards the central message. Imagine this paper 1 style task. Artificial intelligence has become increasingly common in your school. Some teachers believe its use should be heavily restricted, while many students believe it can support learning. You have been invited to address teachers, parents, and students at a school meeting. Discuss the opportunities artificial intelligence offers, explain the risks of relying on it too heavily, and propose principles for responsible use. Your 3 choices are speech, article, or set of guidelines. The speech is the strongest option. The task gives you a school meeting, a clearly defined listening audience, and a purpose that requires discussion and persuasion. A set of guidelines may look tempting because you are asked to propose principles for responsible use. But the task also asks you to discuss opportunities and risks, so guidelines would not support the full argument as naturally. An article could explore both sides in detail, but it would create a different relationship with the audience. Readers would encounter it independently rather than hearing it at the meeting. Once you choose the speech, your opening should immediately fit that situation. You might acknowledge teachers, parents, and students. Recognize how quickly artificial intelligence has entered classrooms, and then introduce the central tension. The issue is no longer whether students will use these tools. The real question is whether they can use them without allowing technology to replace the thinking that education is supposed to develop. Now the speech has direction. The audience is clear. The context is clear. And the central tension is already established. This is also where ethos becomes important. Ethos means credibility. The audience's sense that you are worth listening to. In paper 1, that credibility should usually grow naturally from the role given in the task. If you are a student representative speaking about public transport, use that role. Explain that you regularly hear from students who depend on buses to reach school. You do not need to say, "Trust me." Show the audience why your perspective deserves attention. Credibility also comes from fairness. Suppose you are arguing against library closures. You could acknowledge that the council genuinely needs to control spending, and that public budgets are limited. Then, pivot. Financial pressure is real, but that does not mean the people with the fewest alternatives should carry the greatest cost. This is concession and rebuttal. You recognize something valid in the opposing position, and then explain why your own argument still stands. That creates maturity and depth, especially at higher level. Pathos, or emotional appeal, also works best when it is controlled. Saying, "Many students depend on libraries," is relevant, but undeveloped. Instead, ask the audience to picture a student preparing for final examinations at a kitchen table shared with younger siblings. Every evening, she walks to the library because it is the only quiet place where she can study. Then explain the consequence. Close that library, and you have not simply removed a building. You have removed her study space. Now the problem is no longer abstract. It is human. But be careful with emotion. Specificity is usually more persuasive than exaggeration. You do not need dramatic claims about thousands of dreams being destroyed. Give the audience something concrete to imagine, then let the example do the work. Next comes logos, reasoning. Suppose somebody argues that libraries are no longer necessary because information is available online. Begin by acknowledging what is true. Digital services have undoubtedly expanded, but access to information is not the same as equal access to information. Online services require a device, a reliable connection, digital confidence, and often a suitable place to work. If closing the library removes those things from people who already have the fewest alternatives, then moving the service online has not removed the barrier. It has simply moved it. That is logos. The conclusion comes from the reasoning. And remember, ethos, pathos, and logos do not need separate paragraphs. Strong speeches often layer them naturally. A brief personal experience may establish credibility. A human example may create emotional engagement, and the consequence of that example may provide the logic. The same principle applies to rhetorical techniques. Use them when they have a job to do. A rhetorical question, for example, should guide the audience towards an idea. What does equal opportunity really mean if a quiet place to study is available only to students whose families can afford one? That question exposes a contradiction. It has a purpose. But if every paragraph begins with a rhetorical question, the technique quickly becomes predictable. Use questions strategically, not automatically. Direct address is equally important because the audience should remain present throughout the speech. Sometimes address the whole group. Fellow students, parents and teachers, counselors and residents. Then narrow the focus. Think about the bus you took this morning. Picture the student revising alone in the library. Then widen the argument again. That movement collective, individual collective, can make the speech feel much more immediate. Inclusive pronouns such as we, us, and our can also create shared responsibility, but they need to reflect the real relationship between speaker and listeners. If you are a student speaking to government ministers, do not pretend that you are part of the government. You might say, "Our country faces a choice, and your government has the power to make that choice." The relationship remains accurate. Repetition is especially useful in speech because listeners cannot easily go back and reread an earlier paragraph. But strong repetition develops the message. We need spaces where students can study. We need spaces where job seekers can find support. We need spaces where nobody is excluded because they cannot afford to enter. The structure repeats. The idea develops. Weak repetition simply says the same thing again, using stronger adjectives. Parallel structures and the rule of three can also create rhythm. Accessible, reliable, and free. Or, listen to the evidence, consider the alternatives, and protect these spaces. Used occasionally, this can be memorable. Used in every paragraph, it becomes mechanical. Contrast is another powerful tool because it clarifies choices. Short-term savings versus long-term costs. Private convenience versus public consequence. The world we have now versus the world we could create. A well-controlled contrast can make a complex argument easier to remember. Imagery can do something similar. Instead of simply saying that fast fashion damages the environment, picture a shirt bought on Friday, worn twice, thrown away before the end of the month, and left in landfill long after its owner has forgotten it existed. Now the consequence is visible. Metaphor can help too, but keep it controlled. One strong image is better than several competing ones. Do not begin with society as a bridge, turn it into a battlefield, and finish with everyone sailing on a ship. Anecdotes can also strengthen a speech if they lead somewhere. Imagine you are speaking about artificial intelligence in education. You describe a classmate who submitted an impressive AI-generated essay, but could not explain his own central argument. The point is not simply that this happened. The point is what it reveals. The danger is not only that technology can produce answers. The deeper danger is that students may stop believing they need to understand those answers. That anecdote earns its place because it leads directly to a larger argument. As your speech moves towards action, imperatives become more useful. Protect these services. Consider the alternatives. Demand transparency. Vote against this proposal. But the force of the imperative should fit your role and audience. Modal verbs help you control that force. We could reconsider the policy suggests possibility. We should reconsider the policy gives a recommendation. We must reconsider the policy expresses necessity. Small words, important differences. Tone matters just as much. A persuasive speech is often assertive, but respectful. Imagine you are speaking to counselors. The counsel clearly does not care about young people is unlikely to help your purpose. You are attacking the people whose support you need. A stronger version would be, this proposal seriously underestimates the effect these closures would have on young residents. The disagreement is still clear, but the criticism is directed at the policy rather than the character of the audience. Register must also fit the occasion. A speech at an international conference may require formal language. A school assembly may allow a more conversational style. Formal language is not automatically better language. The best register is the one that fits the relationship between speaker and audience. What matters is consistency. Do not begin as though you are addressing the United Nations, suddenly sound as though you are chatting with friends, and then finish like an academic essay. Vocabulary should also be varied without becoming inflated. Criterion A rewards language that is appropriate and nuanced. It does not reward difficult words simply because they are difficult. Expressions such as short-term savings, long-term consequences, unequal access, public accountability, economic pressure, ethical responsibility, and collective responsibility can be useful because they express precise ideas. Use them naturally. The same principle applies to grammar. Grammatical range does not mean that every sentence should be long and complicated. In fact, speeches often benefit from contrast in sentence length. You might use a longer sentence to develop a complex idea carefully and then follow it with, "That should concern us." Short sentence, clear impact, or reverse the pattern, "Something is wrong." Then explain what is wrong in a longer, more developed sentence. That variation creates rhythm. Relative clauses can also add information naturally. Students who depend on public transport, the community center, which currently supports several youth organizations. Useful complexity, clear meaning. But do not overload a sentence simply to prove that you can use complex grammar. If the listener has to work too hard to follow the sentence, the complexity is no longer helping you. Coherence is equally important. Your audience should always understand why you are moving from one point to the next, instead of relying constantly on firstly, secondly, and thirdly. Use transitions that sound more natural when spoken. But the problem goes deeper than this. Consider another consequence. Yet there is another side to this argument. So what would a realistic solution look like? This brings me to the most important point. Now imagine the alternative. You can also create coherence by returning to one central concept throughout the speech. Suppose your key idea is access. Introduce it early. Later, discuss access to information, then access to opportunity. Finally, return to the idea in your conclusion. Now the repetition creates a thread through the argument. Your body paragraphs also need internal development. A useful pattern is claim, support, significance. Make your point, explain or illustrate it, then show why it matters. Suppose your argument is that investment in renewable energy can strengthen economic resilience. That is the claim. Then explain that a country heavily dependent on imported fuel remains vulnerable to international price shocks and disruptions beyond its control. That is the support. Now show the significance. Developing a broader domestic energy mix is not simply an environmental decision. It is also a question of economic security. That is development. And this is why 2 or 3 strong arguments, developed carefully, are usually more effective than 6 superficial points. Facts and statistics can help, but they are not compulsory. Do not invent an extremely precise number because you think persuasive writing must contain statistics. If the task gives you data, use it, but interpret it. Explain why the figure matters. A statistic without interpretation is simply a number. Now we come to the conclusion. This is where many otherwise strong speeches lose momentum. A student spends most of the response developing thoughtful arguments, then suddenly ends with, "In conclusion, I have discussed the advantages and disadvantages. Thank you for listening." Technically, the speech has ended. Rhetorically, it has collapsed. A strong conclusion should return to the central message, intensify it, and create closure. In a persuasive speech, it should often give the audience a clear direction. Return to the library example. Do not simply repeat that libraries are important. Bring the human consequences back. Ask the audience to see the student preparing for an examination, the parent completing a job application, the child discovering a book that may open an entirely new world. Acknowledge the financial reality. These services cost money. Of course they do. But opportunity has value too. So, offer alternatives. Reduce waste where possible. Build partnerships. Redesign services where necessary. But do not treat complete closure as the only responsible option. Now the conclusion feels like a destination, not an afterthought. To see how everything can work together, imagine one final Paper 1 style task. Your region is experiencing a serious water shortage. The government is considering restrictions on household water use, but residents are concerned that large commercial users may face fewer restrictions. You have been invited as a youth representative to a public consultation. In your text, explain how responsibility for reducing water consumption should be shared. Consider the needs of different groups and persuade the audience to support a fair approach. Your 3 choices are speech, letter to the editor, or set of guidelines. Which one is most appropriate? The speech. You are participating directly in a public consultation. You have a live audience that may include government officials, residents, and business representatives, and your purpose is to influence the debate at that particular moment. A letter to the editor could still present a developed argument and influence public opinion, so it is a plausible alternative. But it changes the communication situation. Instead of speaking directly at the consultation, you would be addressing readers through a publication. A set of guidelines is less appropriate because the main purpose is not simply to tell people how to save water. The task asks you to debate how responsibility should be shared among different groups. So, plan the speech. Your audience includes officials, residents, and perhaps business representatives. Your context is an active shortage and an ongoing policy debate. Your purpose is to persuade people that conservation is necessary, but that responsibility should be shared fairly. And your central message might be, everyone has responsibilities, but fair responsibility does not always mean identical responsibility. Now you have direction. Begin with common ground. Nobody needs to be persuaded that the shortage is serious. People can already see the consequences. Then introduce the real question. The issue is not whether conservation is necessary. It is whether responsibility will be shared fairly. Next, establish credibility. Explain that your own household has already reduced its water use, so the audience cannot dismiss you as someone demanding sacrifice only from others. Then pivot to the main argument. Personal responsibility cannot become a substitute for institutional responsibility. Now develop the reasoning. If hundreds of households reduce consumption while major commercial users continue wasting water through inefficient systems, the policy may demand sacrifice without achieving the greatest possible reduction. Then make the issue human. Ask the audience to imagine a family carefully limiting every shower while driving past sprinklers running across an empty commercial lawn in the middle of the afternoon. The frustration is easy to understand because the audience can picture it, but now acknowledge the other side. Businesses matter. They create employment, provide services, and in some industries, genuinely require large quantities of water. That acknowledgement strengthens your credibility. Then rebut. Necessity is not the same as exemption. Large users should be expected to show how much they consume, why they need it, and what they are doing to reduce waste. Now offer the solution. Households should conserve. Businesses should account. Government should enforce transparent rules. Simple, parallel, memorable, and more importantly, it grows naturally from the argument. Then build towards the conclusion. A drought does not care whether wasted water came from a home, a factory, or a government office. The effect on the reservoir is the same, so the response must be collective. But collective does not mean careless, and fair does not always mean identical. Ask households to contribute. Ask businesses to account for what they use. Ask government to create rules that are transparent enough for everyone to see that responsibility is genuinely being shared. That conclusion works because the speech has been moving towards it from the beginning. And that leads us to the mistakes you should avoid. Do not write an essay wearing a speech costume. A greeting and thank you are not enough. The audience must remain present throughout the response. Do not overload the speech with rhetorical devices. If every paragraph contains a rhetorical question, a rule of three, and a slogan, the examiner begins to notice the machinery instead of the argument. Do not list ideas without developing them. Choose your strongest points, support them, and explain why they matter. Do not lose sight of your purpose. By the final paragraph, the audience should know exactly what you want them to think, feel, or do. Do not attack the people you need to persuade. Do not confuse sophisticated language with unnecessarily difficult vocabulary. Do not forget your role. If the task says you are a student representative, sound like an articulate student representative. And do not forget the context. If a decision is being made tomorrow, create urgency. If the speech follows a particular event, acknowledge it. Above all, do not let the conclusion fade. Build towards it. Before you submit your paper 1 speech, ask yourself, can somebody identify my audience without seeing the prompt? Is my purpose clear? Does the opening sound like a genuine speaking occasion rather than an essay introduction? Have I developed every important part of the task? Have I supported my ideas with examples, details, or reasoning? Does each paragraph add something new? Can the audience follow the progression easily? Does my register fit the relationship between speaker and listeners? Am I assertive without becoming aggressive? Does every rhetorical technique have a purpose? Is my vocabulary varied, but natural? Have I used grammatical complexity selectively rather than mechanically? Would this speech sound clear if somebody actually delivered it aloud? And does my conclusion really conclude? Then ask yourself one final question. If the audience remembered only one idea tomorrow, what would I want that idea to be? If you cannot answer that question, your central message probably needs more work. That is the central lesson. A strong speech has an architecture: audience, credibility, problem, reasoning, human impact, possible change, and action. Start with the audience. Know why you are speaking. Know what response you want. Build a clear central message, and develop your ideas instead of listing them. Use ethos to establish credibility, pathos to make abstract problems human, and logos to make your reasoning convincing. Use direct address to keep the audience present. Use questions to guide thought. Use repetition to make important ideas memorable. Use contrast to sharpen choices. Use imagery when an abstract issue needs to become visible. Use concession when the issue requires nuance. Use imperatives when the moment finally requires action. Control your register, control your rhythm, and, above all, build towards the ending. So, when you see 3 text type options in paper 1, do not begin by asking, which one do I like writing most? Ask, which one best fits this audience, this purpose, and this situation? And once you have chosen the speech, do not begin by asking, which rhetorical device should I use? Ask, what do I want my audience to think, feel, or do when I finish? Then make every paragraph move them towards that destination, because the best speeches do more than present ideas. They organize those ideas clearly, connect them to the people listening, and build towards a response. The audience should not leave quite as it arrived, and that is what makes a speech move people.